evening everyone, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 28 August 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So one by one, we'll try and discuss all these important topics in a very detailed and in-depth manner. So the first topic with which we're going to start this discussion about countering the US tariffs. We all knew that earlier, US has imposed 25% tariffs on Indian goods and followed by that a 25% additional tariffs on Indian exports to US. So the total tariffs amounted to 50%. However, it will be very difficult for Indian goods to cope up with this 50% tariffs. And Indian goods will also lose the competitiveness with other countries' goods in US markets, thereby losing a substantial portion of market in US. So therefore, in this context, let's understand how can India deal with these tariffs and how can India counter the tariffs, so that Indian goods or Indian exports to US or India can find the alternative players so that it can export those goods to the respective countries. So let's understand this, and I have already explained the context. The context is that US has imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods, and in fact it is also considered as a violation of WTO rules. And in fact, in this context, India need to diversify its export basket, and we should not significantly and substantially depend on markets like US. Now, one thing that we understand here is that India exports around 18% of its total goods to US. So therefore, India needs to reduce its dependence on countries like US, right? So in this context, why US has imposed tariffs on Indian goods? US says that India has been purchasing the cheap Russian oil, and that has been fueling the war machine, and that has been fueling the Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. And in fact, there are a number of other countries as well, for example China, Turkey and European Union countries. So these countries are also purchasing Russian oil and natural gas, but US has chosen only India to impose such tariffs. Right, so let's understand US tariff actions and the impact of those tariffs on Indian goods. Now, if we talk about this, we all knew that US has imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods, and the 50% tariffs mostly affect certain sectors. So those sectors including the pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, mobile phones and chemicals. Right, so therefore these products will also get affected by the tariffs which the US has imposed. So therefore these are 25% tariffs on such exports in addition to the earlier imposed 25% tariffs, total 50% of tariffs. So this is a violation of the WTO trade rules. Right, so this is considered as a disregard for the multilateral trade rules. And in fact, India and US, so they earlier set an ambitious bilateral trade goal, right? So they aimed to reach a bilateral trade of $500 billion by the year 2030, right? So even if they have set a goal of reaching $500 billion of bilateral trade. So as of now, so I would say in 2025, before this tariff war between India and US, the bilateral trade was around $110 billion. So they aim to reach the $500 billion. But because of the tariffs, the bilateral trade between India and US would further comes down, further decreases, right? So in fact, the tariffs that US has imposed on Indian goods are also a violation of the WTO's most favored nation principle as well. So let's understand what exactly is a most favored nation principle. So when I say most favored nation principle, it actually means that For example, US has been giving trade concessions to certain countries. So that actually means that US should also consider all other countries, and US should also give those concessions to other countries as well. So US should not discriminate the other countries if it is giving such concessions to one country. So there should be no trade discrimination, right? So against any country, so which is considered as a most favored nation status, and the most favored nation status is part of WTO multilateral trade framework, right? So you can understand the definition of most favored nation here. So it says that it is a requirement that countries providing a trade concession to one trading partner, they should extend the same concessions or the same treatment to the other countries as well. So that is the definition of the most favored nation status. So if we talk about India-US trade, so let's understand the numbers of India and US trade. Now, in the financial year 24, the bilateral trade between India and US, so it stands at 118.2 billion US dollars. So in fact, US was one of the largest trading partners for India, right? So but in the financial year during COVID-19 financial year 2022, so India US trade reached 128.78 billion US dollars, which is huge. So at that point of time, US was India's largest trading partner. And the other advantage is that India used to enjoy a huge trade surplus with US. Now, what is a trade surplus? Now, when I say trade surplus, so India exports more rather than it imports, right? So India exports more rather than what it imports. So which is considered as a trade surplus. And in the financial year 2024, India had a trade surplus of US dollars 36.8 billion with the US. And experts also view that India having a massive trade surplus is also another reason why US under Donald Trump has imposed tariffs on Indian exports. And in the financial year 24, Indian exports in the US stood at 77.5 billion, while American exports to India stood at 40.7 billion, and overall India has been enjoying the trade surplus with US dollar 36.8 billion. And in fact, USA is also the third largest investor in India with a cumulative FDI flows of US dollar 67.76 billion, right? So US is also one of the largest investor in India. So this is the third largest investor of FDI into India. So this is the trade in numbers between India and US. But these tariffs on Indian exports to US so will further result in declining the trade between India and US, and this will also decline the trade surplus that India has been enjoying with US, right? I hope you have understood this. Now let's understand India's challenges and the constraints that India is going to face. So let's understand this aspect as well. So it is being said that nearly 60% of India's exports to US, so they are being concentrated in certain sectors such as pharmaceuticals, mobile phones, gems and jewelry, and engineering goods. So therefore, these sectors are mostly vulnerable to the tariffs that US has imposed on Indian goods, right? So the most affected sectors including pharmaceuticals, mobile phones, gems, jewelry, and engineering goods. Now apart from that, if I add a few more sectors which are vulnerable to US tariffs and which are labor intensive sectors and that impact the livelihoods of the people, including the textiles, leather, footwear. So these are the other important sectors that are going to be affected by the 50% tariffs imposed by US. So because of these tariffs, right, so because of the 50% of tariffs, there is a higher possibility, higher likelihood that India's exports to US will decline. The demand for Indian goods in US markets will also decline. So the Indian goods will be replaced by other competitors like Indonesia, Vietnam, China, right? So they can replace India's demand for Indian goods in US markets, right? So in fact we can say that South and Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, all these countries, so they're being considered as a competitors for Indian goods in US markets. And these competitors with diversified low to medium value exports, so they may replace Indian exporters in the US market, right? And in fact the farmers, the small industries, MSMEs and workers who have been dependent on the affected export sectors, so particularly we need to talk about the textiles, right? So we need to talk about the leather and footwear. So these are the other important sectors which might get affected by the US tariffs, right? So farmers, small industries, workers who are dependent on affected export sectors, so they may also face immediate livelihood risks as well because of the 50% of tariffs, right? So these are the sectors which are going to get affected. Now understand, because 18% of India's total exports are to US, and the effect or the impact is 1% of India's GDP. It is going to affect 1% of India's GDP, and around thousands of jobs will be lost if we don't find the alternative markets. If we don't diversify our export baskets, then thousands of employees will lose their employment. Now what should be the way forward for India? So in this context, the way forward is India must expand its export basket or export destination. So we must diversify the the export destinations. So we should not just depend on US and EU. With European Union and with US we have a trade surplus, which is true, but we should not excessively depend on these countries. So we need to build a strong trade ties with other players as well. For example, we have Asian in Southeast Asia, Africa, BRICS and Latin America. So with all those countries we should build a strong trade relations, so that we will not excessively depend on countries like European Union and US. And trade diversification. Now what exactly is the meaning of trade diversification? So when I say trade diversification, so we diversify our trade. We look for other important players around the world, so that we will not depend on US and European Union alone, right? So that trade diversification is very, very important. And in order to diversify the trade, so we should develop a strong manufacturing base in India as well. So that is very important. So along with the trade diversification, we should simultaneously engage with the WTO dispute mechanisms, so that we can safeguard our interests in US and European Union as well. And in fact, the broader domestic reforms coupled with competitiveness, logistics efficiency, technological upgrading, so all these things need to be taken into consideration. They are critical and they are very important to withstand the global trade shocks, such as US imposing tariffs on Indian goods, right? So I hope you have understood this topic. So the next topic is curbing online gambling addiction. So let's understand, because recently Lok Sabha has passed a bill to curb online gambling addiction, or online games have been banned in India, which are based on, which involves an element of luck. So let's understand about that as well. Now we all knew that the government has imposed a ban on online real money gaming. So in fact the government has given the reasons such as mental health impact, particularly on children and the adolescents, right? So therefore, because of this reason, the online real money gaming has been banned by the government, right? So let's understand about this as well. The psychological and social risks which involved with the online real gaming. Now, real money online games, so they use reward systems, right? So they use reward systems and variable reinforcements, and in fact they also involve risk reward cycles similar to gambling, so thereby fostering a compulsive behavior, right? They actually foster a compulsive behavior, and the adolescent very often experience secrecy, academic decline, and strained family relationships with addiction takes hold. And there are certain mental health concerns as well, because there are cases of anxiety, depression, and even suicidal tendencies, and these factors are being linked to the compulsive gaming behavior. So overall we can say that proved mental health issues are very common among people who play real online money games. So this is a very serious problem that has to be dealt with. And in fact, many using non-real money gaming versions such as poker and rummy. And in fact, betting on online WhatsApp groups with friends, family for apps like JJ Poker, PPP Poker, right? So betting is very common. So betting has to be promoted because betting is also associated with the social risks and the psychological risks. And VPN is being excessively used or employed to mask the geolocation and also the IP address of individuals who have been involved in this real online money games or betting. And in fact, they are also taking the help of a proxy to register, complete KYC, and share the login details. And in fact, experts say many are getting into the illegal sports betting, and the illegal sports betting is having a huge consequences, right? And in fact, Telegram groups for games like Ludo sometimes have over 16,000 members as well. So this is very obvious that it is having a huge social risk, and sometimes people who have involved in betting lost money, so they are also committing suicides along with the mental health issues. So therefore this is a huge issue that needs an urgent attention from the government. The government should take this into consideration and should address this problem as well. So if we talk about the types of online gaming, so there are different types of online gaming. For example, fantasy sports, esports, casual games, and educational games, right? So if we talk about the fantasy games, so here users create a virtual teams using proxies of real players from sports such as cricket and football and others, right? For example, a Dream 11 is an example of fantasy sports. And esports also, so esports are usually played in a multiplayer format, and these are popular among the professional gamers and also generally involve the tournaments, and these include PUBG and League of Legends, all these things. So these games also involve a huge amount of betting as well. So there are certain skill based casual games as well, for example chess, Ludo, Candy Crush. So these are the different types of games which have involved. So let's understand about this Promotion and Regulation of Online Gaming Bill 2025. So what measures that it has brought in. And in fact, the Promotion and Regulation of Online Gaming Bill 2025 actually prohibits offering, operation, facilitation, and advertisement, promotion, and participation in online money games. So therefore it takes into consideration all these different factors, and it has prohibited all elements of online real money gaming or gambling. Now in fact, if I say real money gaming, so this real money gaming refers to platforms such as Dream 11, Pokerbazi, where players risk their money for winning, right? So that is the huge problem. So if players lose their money, they borrow money from somewhere else and they play such games and they lose money, and they even commit suicide as well if they lost the money. So there are several such incidents, and it is also having the social risk and social consequences, psychological consequences as well. And in fact, the industry has argued that fantasy games are those of skill and cannot be regulated by the states as gambling. So some people say that it involves an element of skill. Rather, they involve an element of luck. So therefore, they should be banned. They should be categorized as gambling. And in fact, this bill also makes a huge distinction between the games of chance and the games of skill. Right? So it seeks to ban all online money gaming as well. However, the industry says that it has an annual revenue exceeding 31,000 crores and that it employs over 2 lakh people as well. So this is the industry concern with respect to the online games ban by the government. Now, if we talk about the punishments which are prescribed under the Promotion and Regulation of Online Gaming Bill 2025. So the bill actually proposes imprisonment up to 3 years and a fine up to 1 crore for those entities which still offer facilitating online money gaming. So therefore it actually involves a huge penalty. And in fact, this bill also seeks to prohibit advertisements related to online money games, and it also bars banks and other financial institutions from transferring funds for any such games as well. And advertising can also attract imprisonment of up to 2 years and fine up to 50 lakh as well. So therefore, facilitating financial transactions that can lead to imprisonment up to 3 years and up to 3 years and a fine of up to 1 crore as well. Now let's understand the family and societal impact of such online games. Now, in fact, the problem is that families discover such problems very late, usually after the financial or the academic crisis an individual face. So therefore, by such a time, the intervention by the family would be very difficult, and it's too late for the family to take the situation under control. And in fact, once an individual is addicted to the online real money games, it will contribute to secrecy, aggression, and the behavioral changes or behavioral problems from that particular individual, and it overall leads to eroding trust within the household as well. The online money real money gaming, the issue also imposes costs such as therapy, suicide prevention, and the need for the long-term rehabilitation as well. So what should be the way forward in this context? If we talk about the way forward, so a balanced regulatory framework treating gaming addiction as a behavioral and mental health issue is essential, and it is very, very important. So we need to take this as a mental health issue. We need to consider this as a mental health issue. So therefore, we need to have a balanced regulatory framework. And apart from that, we need to regularly conduct screening in schools, counseling, and digital literacy campaigns. So all these different attempts or measures can help prevent the harmful outcomes, and they can also help prevent the addiction of students to the real money games as well. And combining robust regulation with awareness is also very, very important. And family guidance can also ensure a healthier relationships within the family as well. So I hope you have understood that topic. And next topic is particularly vulnerable tribal groups. They are being called as PVTGs. So let's understand the context first, and then we will also understand who are PVTGs and why the government has been planning to categorize them. So recently, the Ministry of Tribal Affairs has requested the Registrar General to enumerate the particularly vulnerable tribal groups separately. Right? So we all knew that the census exercise is being carried out very soon, and the Ministry of Tribal Affairs has requested the Registrar General of India to carry out the census for the particularly vulnerable tribal groups separately in this census. Right? So this separate census for PVTGs will help improve welfare targeting of particularly vulnerable tribal groups. So who are these particularly vulnerable tribal groups? So they are the most vulnerable people. PVTGs are the most vulnerable people or most vulnerable tribal groups. So they have a certain characteristics, right? So they have certain characteristics, and because of those characteristics we call them as particularly vulnerable tribal groups, such as declining or stagnant population, lower levels of literacy, pre-agricultural level of technology, and are economically backward as well, right? So these are the chief characteristics of the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. So let's understand the status of PVTGs in India. And PVTGs inhabit the isolated, remote and difficult areas in small and scattered hamlets or habitats, such as 75% such groups of tribals in 18 states and 1 union territory. So they have been identified and categorized as particularly vulnerable tribal groups. So as of now they are living in 18 states and 1 union territory, which is Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So let's understand the historical and policy background of the PVTGs. Now, as we have already discussed, that PVTGs are the most backward and most vulnerable and marginalized within the scheduled tribes. And in fact, they were identified in 1973 based on the criteria. So for example, pre-agricultural level of technology or primitive technology, lower levels of literacy is the second criteria. Pre-agricultural level of technology, lower levels of literacy, and economic backwardness, and the stagnant population. So this is the criteria that is being used to recognize the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now in 2011, 40 particularly vulnerable tribal groups were enumerated within the broader scheduled tribe category, but separate data was maintained for these particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now here, Ministry of Tribal Affairs asked the Registrar General of India to enumerate the census data separately for the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, so that it will help in better welfare targeting of PVTGs, Now presently there are 75 PVTGs across 18 states and 1 union territory, which is Andaman and Nicobar Islands. But despite that, they remain inadequately represented in official statistics. So you can see here is Odisha is the largest. Odisha is the state with the largest number of particularly vulnerable tribal groups, right? So followed by Andhra Pradesh. So in Andhra Pradesh, around 12 PVTGs are living. In Odisha, 13 PVTGs are living. So apart from that, there are some other states in which the PVTGs are living, right? So their total population is 28 lakh population. So let's understand the socio-economic vulnerabilities of particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now the female literacy is a very low among the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, because in Odisha recently a study has been conducted in 2020 and 23, and this has revealed that the lower levels of literacy among the PVTG women and other genders, and in fact there are also critical healthcare gaps as well. Healthcare is not properly provided to them. And apart from that, PVTGs are also facing higher levels of malnutrition, poor access to health facilities, as it has been highlighted in the Journal of Health, Population and Nutrition in 2024. That essentially means that PVTGs are also facing other issues, right? Education, healthcare, nutrition, population decline, lower levels of literacy. So these are the main problems that the PVTGs are facing. Now in fact, in 2023, an ambitious scheme has been launched by the union government, which primarily targets the PVTGs. The scheme is PM Janman scheme. So this scheme has been launched to target the tribal groups. Despite such interventions, such programs, the progress remains slow due to lack of precise data and the monitoring over the developmental interventions such as PM Janman. Now what should be the way forward in this context? So if we talk about the way forward, we need to have a separate enumeration as requested by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, so that there will be better targeting of PVTGs when it comes to the welfare and developmental programs, right? So this separate enumeration under the census data, it actually provides a disaggregated data to design precise welfare measures, and it can also help track the socio-economic conditions of the PVTGs. The outdated pre-agricultural technology. So this definition must be revisited, and modernization has altered the socio-economic realities of many communities as well. And apart from that, apart from addressing exclusion through education, skill development, healthcare, and cultural sensitive tools is vital for the empowerment of the PVTGs. So in fact, the PM Janman is an ambitious scheme which aimed at the overall development of the PVTGs, and apart from that, education should be focused, healthcare should be focused, skill development should be focused area, and apart from that, a culturally sensitive tools should also be developed for the overall development and empowerment of the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.